Jersey, that's how I put it to a boyfriend I lived with in Tel Aviv, when he suggested that I leave Israel and move with him to Vancouver. For me, it was simple. If he loved me, he'd have to understand that living in Israel is part of the package. Is that too much to ask? Well, he moved out, and I decided to start dating the natives. Now, I never felt like the hot hunk of Israeli man was exactly my type, but if it meant I got to live my life in Israel, I had to be open to the possibility that the right sovereign was out there for me somewhere. However, dating actual Israelis proved even more complicated. Meeting an American girl in Tel Aviv, they loved the idea of being whisked off to live in the States for a few years, or forever. They couldn't imagine why I'd actually want to live in Israel by choice. So, as I stood alone on the balcony of my rooftop apartment in Tel Aviv, I felt like Rapunzel, waiting for my American Zionist dream man to climb on my braids and join me to build my dream life in Israel. I'd be the matriarch of my American-Israeli family. He'd get a job that paid its salary in American dollars and took us on frequent trips to the States that allowed us to see our respective families just the right amount. Together, we'd raise beautiful, confident Israeli children, a boy named Asaf and a girl named Aviv, who'd speak perfect English and bicker with each other at the dinner table in unaccented Hebrew. If Israel really wanted to keep me here, it would send me someone to love, who loved me and loved Israel, and we'd all live happily ever after. But in my quest to find love in Israel, I could never seem to find someone whose connection to the country quite matched with mine. So when I moved to New York, it was important to me that any love interest I have would understand my love for Israel. However, for as many Jewish men as there are in New York, finding someone with a healthy love and respect for Israel is harder than you'd imagine. I go on dates with perfectly acceptable Jewish guys who'd say things like, "I have no desire to ever go to Israel." It's like telling me my baby's ugly. How could I get involved with someone who'd say such a thing? Then, a fellow Israel lover responded to my online dating profiles. On our first date, in a Middle Eastern restaurant, I confided in him that I found it hard to date American Jews who didn't have a connection to Israel. He totally agreed and said,
"Israel will always be an important part of my life. I need someone who understands that."
He had me at Shalom. Before Shabbat was over, we were a couple. I cooked dinners for him with all made in Israel ingredients. I read over his shoulder as he devoured hardbacks about the Six-Day War or the life of Avi Iban. And every night when I whispered Lila Tov to him, I was so happy I'd met someone who felt good saying those words back to me. Before I knew it, we were headed back to Israel on a homecoming trip together. And that's when Israel began to pull us apart. He could see in my eyes how much I loved Israel, how I glowed just walking the streets of my old neighborhood in Tel Aviv. I was seeing the shopkeepers in the square below my old apartment brought tears to my eyes.
I don't understand how you could just walk away from all this.
I'd move back in a heartbeat if you'd come with me. If he couldn't see himself living in Israel, what would he do for work? His Hebrew wasn't that good. All the rational reasons.
Would you want to be with me if I didn't love Israel?
I didn't have a good answer to that question. As far as I was concerned, being with someone who loved Israel was the next best thing to being there. But after seeing me in Israel, he never looked at me quite the same again. When we got back to New York, I moved out of his apartment. Tried to figure out a way to move on. Love and Israel. I wanted both, but suddenly, I had neither. Part of me figured that if everything happens for a reason, then maybe this was all happening because I was meant to meet someone who'd take me back to Israel for good. But after going on several first dates with guys who had varying degrees of Israel connection, it started to sink in that maybe having a connection to Israel didn't necessarily lead to a love connection. So, I lowered my threshold for the degree to which someone I dated needed to love Israel. He'd have been there before and or be positively predisposed to the place. I was not going to let Israel just say my love life anymore. That didn't stop me from blabbering on all night about Israel on my first date with a guy I actually felt a genuine connection with. I went home thinking, why did I have to go about Israel all night? He's going to think I'm not interested in involved with anyone here. Fortunately, he asked me out again. And over a glass of red wine, he asked me, point blank, why I left Israel. I ran off my standard answer that I felt like I had a ceiling there, professionally, socially, creatively. But he pressed on and asked me if I'd give one reason why I left. One reason. What would it be? Love. I blurted out, shocked and flustered, having actually answered that question truthfully. So into the silence, I repeated, love. And sat there even more flustered by the fact that I just told someone I'm on a second date with that I left the country I lived in for 9 years and loved more than anything for the prospect of finding real love in my life. And that's when he reached out across the table, grabbed my hands and said,
I understand.
And holding my shaking hands, he repeated,
I understand.
After we'd been dating for a while, I worked up the courage to ask him if he felt like I talked about Israel too much on our first date.
No, I liked how you can be so passionate about something. I liked the way your eyes lit up when you talked about Israel.
Really? Maybe that's all anyone's looking for someone who's willing to understand the things that are most important to them, no matter what those things are. But maybe especially if one of those things is love and the other is Israel.